Imagine being singled out, humiliated, and kicked out of an airport for something completely unfair. This is exactly what happened to a young black girl who was just trying to catch her flight. She was treated with such blatant disrespect by the airport staff, who made her feel like she didn't belong. But what they didn't know was that she wasn't just any girl. Her father was someone with power and influence, and when he arrived, everything changed in an instant. The way she was treated by the airport staff was beyond shocking. In front of a crowd, she was embarrassed and forced to leave the terminal without any explanation. But as the situation spiraled out of control, the young girl's father, a well-known businessman, walked through the door. What followed was something the airport staff would never forget. Why did they treat her so badly? What happened when her father confronted them? Stay tuned to find out how the entire airport staff regretted their actions, and how this incident turned into a powerful lesson in respect, privilege, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The young girl, whose name was Maya, had been traveling alone for the first time. She was nervous but excited, heading to visit her aunt in another city. Everything seemed fine at first, until she was called over by one of the airport staff members. They claimed she had violated some vague security protocol, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Maya tried to explain, but the staff wasn't interested in listening. Their harsh words and dismissive attitude only made her feel smaller and more powerless by the second. It wasn't long before other passengers started to notice, whispering amongst themselves as Maya stood there, humiliated. The security officer who'd flagged her was insistent, pointing to her as if she were the problem. And then, without warning, they told her to leave. To make things worse, they escorted her out of the terminal like she was a criminal. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she walked out, feeling completely alone and abandoned in a place that should have been safe. But as she stood there, waiting outside for what felt like an eternity, Maya's thoughts went straight to her father. He was always her protector, her rock. Little did the airport staff know, her father wasn't someone they wanted to cross. The moment he stepped into the scene, everything was about to change. Maya stood outside, trying to steady her breathing, the cool air doing little to calm her racing heart. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How had things escalated so quickly? Her mind flashed back to the moment when she was stopped at security. It was supposed to be a routine check, but something about the way they looked at her, the way they treated her, felt wrong from the start. There was a sharpness in their eyes, like they were waiting for her to make a mistake. When they finally told her to leave, she was too stunned to argue. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tried calling her dad, but there was no answer. She texted him, her fingers shaking as she typed, hoping for some reassurance. But inside, she felt a sinking feeling that she didn't know how to handle. Maya had always been taught to stand tall, to never let anyone see her doubt herself. But in that moment, surrounded by strangers who seemed to think the worst of her, she couldn't help but feel small. Back inside the terminal, the airport staff was beginning to murmur among themselves. They hadn't realized who Maya was or the power her family held until it was too late. They'd thought she was just another teenager, someone easy to push around. But word started to spread. Whispers about her father, a man who was known in business circles for his generosity, but also for his fierce protection of his family. He was no stranger to standing up for what was right, especially when it came to injustice. As Maya's father, Mr. Lawson, stepped into the airport, the air shifted. He was tall, his presence commanding attention even in a crowd. His reputation had always preceded him, and as soon as he entered, the staff who had so confidently dismissed his daughter froze. No one had expected him to show up. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He approached the front desk, his eyes scanning the area, locking onto the staff members who had humiliated his daughter. There was no fury in his expression yet, just a calm that made the tension around him feel suffocating. Maya's father wasn't someone to raise his voice or lose control. He had built his empire by carefully choosing his battles, and this one he was determined to win. He turned to the same staff member who had been the most aggressive, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Explain to me," he began, his voice low but firm, "why my daughter was escorted off this property. And don't even try to lie to me." The staff member stammered, clearly caught off guard. The others nearby shifted uncomfortably, realizing that they were no longer in control of the situation. Maya's father had a way of making people feel like they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't undo. The fear was palpable now, but still the full weight of the situation had yet to hit. Behind the desk, the supervisor, who had been watching everything unfold from a distance, hurried over. She wasn't sure whether to apologize, explain, or pretend like nothing had happened. But it was already clear that the damage was done, and the consequences would go far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The supervisor finally stepped forward, her eyes darting nervously from Maya's father to the staff members who had been involved. She could tell this was no ordinary confrontation. The power in the room had shifted, and now it wasn't just about one girl or a simple mistake. It was about something much bigger. The murmurs among the staff grew quieter as they realized the weight of the situation was far beyond their control. Maya's father stood perfectly still, his posture unshaken. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no anger in his voice, just an unsettling calm that made everyone around him feel like they were walking on thin ice. "I'll ask you again," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Why was my daughter treated this way?" The supervisor glanced around, but no one seemed willing to speak up. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Finally, one of the staff members, the same officer who had escorted Maya out, took a step forward. His face had turned pale. "It was a mistake, sir," he stammered, the words coming out like a half-hearted apology. "There was a misunderstanding at security. She was just." "A misunderstanding." Maya's father cut him off, his voice rising slightly, still controlled, but with a sharp edge. "Do you know how many people you humiliated today? How many witnesses saw what you did to her? Do you know what it's like to be treated like a criminal without any reason, and for no other reason than the way she looks?" The room fell silent again, but now the tension felt like it was building up to something no one could escape. The staff member tried to speak again, but Maya's father held up his hand, silencing him. The supervisor swallowed hard, glancing at her colleagues who were now visibly uncomfortable. She could feel the pressure mounting, and for a split second, she wondered if anyone would take responsibility for what had happened. But she knew deep down that this wouldn't just blow over. Whatever happened next, this was going to have consequences. The last thing she wanted was to be the one to break the news to her higher-ups. The airport's reputation was on the line now, and there was no way to put this Jenny back in the bottle. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't possibly get any thicker, Maya stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Her heart was still pounding, but something had changed inside her. She was no longer just a scared girl hoping for an apology. She was the daughter of a man who knew how to fight, and now she was ready to stand up for herself. "Maya," her father said, his eyes softening for a moment as he turned toward her. She nodded, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. "I want them to understand what they did, Dad. I want them to know that they can't get away with this." Her words rang out in the silence, and for a moment, everything felt like it was on the edge of breaking. Would the airport staff finally own up to their actions? Would they apologize, or would they try to cover it up and make it worse? The eyes of the entire terminal were on them now, and Maya's father knew that this moment would change everything. But how it would change, no one could say just yet. Just as Maya stood there, her father's reassuring presence beside her, ready to make her voice heard, the unexpected happened. The supervisor, who had been silently weighing the situation, suddenly stepped back. Her face paled further, and her hands trembled slightly as she looked at Maya's father. We have to tell you something," the supervisor finally said, her voice cracking. "It wasn't just a misunderstanding." Maya's father narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, not just a misunderstanding?" Before she could respond, the door to the manager's office swung open, and a man in a suit, one that clearly marked him as someone with authority, stepped into the fray. He was tall, his posture stiff, and his gaze was piercing. Everyone in the room instinctively straightened up. The supervisor looked visibly relieved to see him, but Maya could sense something wasn't right. This wasn't the solution she was hoping for. "Mr. Carter," the supervisor said, "I think it's time we talk to you about this." The man, Mr. Carter, took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Maya's father. "I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than you realize," he said with an air of finality. Maya's heart skipped a beat. What could be more complicated than what had already happened? The airport had humiliated her, and the staff had shown no remorse. How could they make this worse? "It's not just about your daughter," Mr. Carter continued, his voice cool but full of hidden weight. "We've been monitoring your family's movements for a while now. Your business dealings, they don't align with some of our security protocols. There's been some concern about your connections." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Maya's father's face darkened, but there was no explosion of anger. Instead, his gaze became colder, sharper, like a man who had just learned something that would change everything. "You're accusing me of something?" he asked, his tone unnervingly calm. "We're not accusing you directly," Mr. Carter replied, his eyes flickering nervously. "But we have protocols in place, sir. And sometimes, those protocols lead us to make certain assumptions. We didn't know she was your daughter at first." Maya's head spun. The way they had treated her, was it because of her father? Was this all part of a bigger picture she didn't understand? The pieces weren't fitting, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just about an airport mistake. This was about something darker, something she couldn't yet see. Her father stepped forward, his presence now overwhelming. "You've been monitoring my family," he said, his voice low, every word weighted with authority. "What else do you know?" Mr. Carter hesitated, glancing back at the supervisor. The room was thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that preceded something dangerous. Maya's pulse raced. It felt like the walls were closing in on them, like whatever was coming next would shatter everything they had known. Just then, Maya noticed something in the corner of her eye, another figure, a shadow, moving quietly through the crowd. It was a man in a dark jacket, his face partially obscured. He was making his way toward them, unnoticed by most, but Maya could feel a shift in the atmosphere as he got closer. Her heart stopped. Who was he? And why did he seem to be approaching with such purpose? "Maya," her father murmured, noticing the direction of her gaze. "Stay close." The tension in the room escalated as the mystery man closed the distance. Mr. Carter seemed to recognize him too. His face went stiff, his earlier calm replaced by an almost palpable anxiety. The man was moving quickly now, and it was clear he wasn't here for any friendly conversation. The stakes were rising fast, and Maya felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether the ground would give way or if someone was about to pull her back to safety. The answers she sought were close, too close, but they were also tangled in a web of secrets that no one seemed willing to untangle. And just as the mysterious man reached them, he spoke one word that would change everything. "It's not just the airport you should be worried about." The mysterious man's words hung in the air, a chilling declaration that sent a ripple of unease through everyone in the room. "It's not just the airport you should be worried about." Maya's heart raced. Her father's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, as though he could sense the danger before she did. The man's gaze was intense, his eyes fixed on her father with an unsettling familiarity. "Who are you?" Maya's father demanded, his voice now edged with danger. "And what are you talking about?" The man's lips curled into a half smile. "Let's just say, the airport is the least of your problems. Your connections, Mr. Lawson, they've attracted more attention than you realize. The people who run this airport, they've been keeping a much closer eye on you than anyone cares to admit." Maya's mind spun as she tried to piece together what was happening. Who was this man? And why did he sound like he knew everything about her father's business dealings? Was this some kind of setup? Had they been targeting her all along, using the airport as a cover for something bigger? Her father's eyes narrowed, his face like stone. I've had enough of these games. If you're going to make threats, you better start making sense. The man's gaze flicked over to the airport staff, and it was then that Maya saw the faintest flicker of recognition on their faces. They weren't just employees, they were involved. Somehow, they were tangled in this web of lies, secrets, and power. The supervisor stepped back, her expression unreadable, while Mr. Carter shifted uncomfortably, clearly on edge.